This presentation is for ICP, Chapter 1-2, Using a Scientific Approach, covered in the text on page 7 through 11. What is the scientific method? This is a structured way of investigating and evaluating questions. There are a number of steps. Different books will have different numbers of steps. Your text has 4. So, making observations, forming a hypothesis, testing a hypothesis, and drawing conclusions. Making observations involves noticing something that leads to a question. I wonder why the sky is blue. Why is it foggy down in that valley but not up on the tops of the mountains? And although we tend to think of observation as a visual process in the scientific sense, you can get observations or make observations with any of the 5 senses. The next step is to form a hypothesis. And part of this involves making an inference. And an inference is a logical interpretation based on current information. For example, if I'm outside and I observe that the temperature is dropping, the wind is picking up, and it's getting very cloudy, I might infer that it's about to rain. So inference is an important part of the scientific method. And a hypothesis, although in middle school it tends to be called an educated guess, really a better high school definition for hypothesis is a testable explanation for a set of observations. Notice the test is in bold and underlined. It's got to be testable, otherwise it's just a question or an explanation. Third step is testing the hypothesis. And you will design, set up, and conduct a test or an experiment to accept or reject the hypothesis. When you are testing a hypothesis, it's a good idea to set up what's called a controlled experiment. It should be designed so that only one variable is changed. If the design is such that more than one variable changes, it's impossible to tell which variable caused the results that you observe. In this example on the slide, you've got an animal behavior study involving small insects and their behavior in wet and dry environments. And if you notice this table of information, all but one of the parameters is the same. So the number of bugs at the start is the same, the temperature is the same, so is the filter paper, so is the light. The only one that's different is the moisture, either wet or dry, and so that is the variable that you're interested in. Specifically, that would be called the independent or the manipulated variable. It's the single variable that the experimenter deliberately changes. When you graph information with an independent variable, it always goes on the x-axis. And here we have another example of plant growth investigation. In this case, we've got 3 different colors of light potentially affecting the growth of plants. And in this case, the variable that can be directly and deliberately changed by the experimenter is the color of the light, which makes the color of the light the independent variable. The dependent or the responding variable is the variable that is observed and measured as it responds to the independent variable. In this case, it is the growth of the plants in response to the color of the light. And when you graph this kind of data, you should always put the dependent variable numbers on the y-axis. Here's a summary image showing the 3 variables: the independent variable, the dependent variable, and the controlled variable. So the liquid that you're using to water the plant is the independent variable. The responding or dependent variable is the growth of the plant in response to what you're watering it with. And the controlled variables is everything else that you maintain constant, like the type of plant, the size of the pot, the amount of liquid, soil type, etc. If possible, during an experiment, you should attempt to set up what's called a control group. And a control group is exposed to all the same conditions as the experimental group, except for the independent variable, the one that you're interested in. And that's how you provide for a control group. After the experiment has been done and the data has been collected, the final step is to draw conclusions, where you interpret the data, summarize the results, accept or reject the hypothesis, and consider ideas for future research. So in the example cartoon, the conclusion is that pollution has a negative effect on fish growth. The character goes on to comment, "I wonder which chemicals specifically are responsible," which would be an idea for future research. And in fact, this also emphasizes another aspect of the scientific method, which is it's actually a cycle rather than a linear process. So the initial observation leads to a hypothesis, which is tested, results are gathered and conclusions are drawn, and that often then feeds back or leads to new observations, new information, and another cycle of inquiry. Now, oftentimes we discuss scientific theories and laws without understanding exactly what theories and laws are. They mean a little slightly different than they do in the common usage. For example, a scientific theory is a well-tested, and by well-tested, generally hundreds of experiments, if not more, explanation for a set of observations or experimental results. It's not, as it is used in the common sense, a guess, a hunch, or a supposition. A scientific law describes an observed pattern in nature without attempting to explain it. The explanation is actually provided by a scientific theory. So a law is not more or less supported than a theory. They are different types of explanation, or actually a theory is an explanation. A law is simply an observation of what you would expect to happen under a particular set of circumstances. Scientific models are often employed when it's impossible to visualize the actual process or structure, so it's either a mental or physical representation of an object or event, and they're used to make things easier to understand that might be too difficult to observe directly. We will be using several types of models. Most specifically, the one that comes to mind is we will be discussing both historical and modern models of atomic structure. Nobody's actually seen the inside of an atom, but it can be modeled based on indirect lines of evidence. And so we will see various models ranging from very simple historical models to the more complicated quantum physics models of the modern day. Safety, we will discuss safety issues, the location of safety equipment, so that whether we're working in the small lab or the mega lab, we will know where and how to use the safety equipment. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or jot down some questions that you have and be ready for discussion at the beginning of class tomorrow.